say that name. Yes.
Junior Barber was.
Yes.
To that
So he is. Yes, he is a legend here in Plattsburgh. That's
good. Dobro.
I was just listening to that interview yesterday, and they were talking all about Junior Barber. I'll be damned.
Okay,
small world.
Yeah, it's a really small world up here.
Well, it is, and reading the book, so many names. My wife works for Peter Payne.
Oh, she does? At the bank?
At the bank. Oh. She's VP of marketing at Champlain National. So we obviously know Peter well. So
yeah, well, there's a lot of Peter Payne stories.
Yeah, yeah. Now, did you guys go back and are those fresh interviews in the trailer, or is that stuff that you did a few years ago?
Yeah, Paul and I interviewed about 6 people together this year.
Oh, okay. So that's I was going to say it looks.
Yeah,
the video looks.
The trailer is all except Frank Cashier.
Yep,
that's
I realized because he passed, didn't he?
Yeah, he died 2016. I
okay,
think.
So yeah.
But yeah, the original video was not HD. It was standard definition, and Paul was really kind of dismissive of it. I think it looks fine, but
I do too. The Frank Cashier interview, I saw it. I thought it. I was like, God, that looks pretty good. If that was that beta, or I don't know what what format it would have been back then.
It was just a. I think the term was standard definition.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyway.
You were ready? All right. Good. So we have the luxury. We will, when this airs, and I'm not sure how many weeks it will be, we will show the trailer. So that will set up coming into us. So,
yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Stephanie Gorin was our second choice for narrator.
Yes.
But I think she's turned out great.
She is fine. She was my co-anchor across town at the NBC station for 12 years. Susan Arbetter, though, is a close friend and lover, and if I wish, yes,
she wanted to do it.
I know. Damn Spectrum.
Yeah, exactly.
She would have been perfect. She has a great voice. She's such a good friend of public television.
Yeah,
obviously.
she would have helped us
even
get
though she's
on other stations.
Gone to the dark side.
Yeah. I got that feeling from talking to her that, but anyway.
Well, but when Liz Benjamin left, she was the obvious choice to step in. So I'm happy for her, but we miss her. We worked with her both at MHT when she was there, and then when she was at CNY. So she was kind enough and would come up and be on our panel for debates, and so she would have been wonderful. Stephanie's wonderful too. We love her, but yep.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, originally we asked Sigourney Weaver.
Yeah, which
she was filming in Italy.
I'd
love to. That's like the board members of the Adirondack Museum. I'd love to.
Yes.
I'm filming in Italy.
And I don't know who at the Wild Center, what the connections were that got her to do their film a few years ago.
She wasn't filming in Italy.
Well, she would have been wonderful too. She would have been. We had Judy Woodruff do one of our documentaries on loons in the Adirondacks. Before I got here, so I don't know how that came about.
Wow.
So and that was good, but
she loves loons, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know, and I can't remember if they're like Jane Pauley, if there are obvious ties to the Adirondacks for her. I never heard the story behind it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm chit-chatting. We'll get going here.
Okay.
So, all right. I will count us down in 5, 4, 3. That documentary will be premiering here on Mountain Lake PBS this fall. It's based on a new book called A Wild Idea, How the Environmental Movement Tamed the Adirondacks. It looks at the creation of the APA, the Adirondack Park Agency, 50 years ago this summer. And we are happy to be joined by the author, Brad Edmonson. It's so nice to have you. Welcome.
Thank you.
This didn't start out as a book, did it?
No.
How did this happen?
I'm an independent journalist, and I was asked if I'd be interested in doing oral history interviews with the people who set up the APA. And I was really happy to get the assignment. And originally, I just did my background research and went up with a tape recorder and occasionally a video camera and had these wonderful conversations of 1 hour or more with these fascinating people. By the time it was done, I had 1,500 pages of transcripts and hours and hours and hours of tape. And but the grant ran out, and I just put it in a filing cabinet for 10 years.
How did it end up coming out of that filing cabinet and into the pages of this book?
Well, you know, it was mocking me from the filing cabinet, from the edge of my office, saying, "Brad, when are you going to do something about this?" Nobody knew about the project. So in 2017, I went to the Adirondack Experience Museum and said, "Would you be interested in being the curator of this material?" And they said, "Yeah, but also we've been looking for a way to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Adirondack Park Agency. So why don't we fundraise for a documentary, and while we're at it, we'll put on a conference and an online exhibit and maybe some other things." And by the time those plans took shape, I thought, well, I should probably write a book. So that's how the book came about.
And we will be happy to air the documentary coming up in a few months here at Mountain Lake PBS.
Yeah, it's coming together really well.
So the book looks at this bold idea, and you interviewed many of these key players, these pioneers who had this vision to protect the Adirondacks, to keep the Adirondack Park from experiencing what Vermont and other states did at the same time, being developed, in many cases overdeveloped, with thousands of vacation homes and resorts in these rural areas. And so this core group had this vision of taking action.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way of saying it. And it wasn't that vacation homes were a bad thing per se. It was the way that they were being proposed, where corporations were buying big tracts of rural land where there were no zoning controls at all, and also no infrastructure at the town and village level to take care of the houses once they were put up. And then the houses in those subdivisions would be built in a haphazard way, and they'd create huge zoning problems and also visual problems for the towns and villages that allowed them to happen. So there were a number of different people who were alarmed at the prospect of this happening inside the Adirondack Park. Environmentalists were alarmed by it. Hiking groups that sort of became environmentalists were alarmed by it, and planners were also alarmed by it. And these were the very groups that had the ear of Governor Nelson Rockefeller in the late 60s and early 70s.
And one of the key people who had the ear of Nelson Rockefeller, well known in Plattsburgh, Harold Jerry.
Exactly. Harold Jerry was a Plattsburgh boy who loved the forest preserve, loved the forever wild clause, and because he'd been a state senator and had worked with Rockefeller on a statewide planning commission in the early 60s, he had Rockefeller's confidence. His daughter reminded me a few weeks ago not to say that they were friends. She said they really weren't friends, but I think Rockefeller trusted him.
And Rockefeller chose him to bring together this group, the Temporary Study Commission.
The staff of the Temporary Study Commission. Jerry was the staff director, and then there were commissioners who were actually going to be considering the staff's research and drafting the plan and voting on the plan. And a very prominent North Country figure, Richard Lawrence, was on that commission, as well as Peter Payne Jr. And Peter Payne is sort of the last man standing from that original group.
And you interviewed Peter for the documentary, obviously also talked to him a lot for the book, a lot of insight from Peter about what happened behind the scenes during these years.
Yeah, Peter was a great source. His memory is crystal clear. He's very well spoken, and he was a great person to rely on.
So why did this happen? What was happening in the mid to late 60s that prompted this?
There were several things that were coming together. One was the environmental movement. If you weren't around in the late 60s and early 70s, it's hard really to explain the suddenness and the power with which the environmental movement just blew up. And in 1970, if you wanted to get reelected, particularly in New York, and you needed the voters of New York City to get reelected, you had to have strong environmental positions. Earth Day in 1970 was this massive, almost an evangelical gathering of concern for the health of the planet and concern about air and water pollution. So I think Governor Rockefeller was also the right person to bring this idea forward, because he always described himself as a problem solver. He loved to build things, and he loved to get smart people together into a room and give them a complex problem and see what kind of solutions they worked out. He loved study commissions. He appointed 13 of them just in the year that he appointed the Temporary Study Commission. So Rockefeller was the right governor. The environmental movement was really coming up and peaking just as the Adirondack Park Agency bill was introduced into the legislature.
Was he worried about the state of the environment in the Adirondacks, or what was happening, the threat of potential development? Was he worried about pollution? Was Nelson Rockefeller focused on the Adirondacks and an environmentalist at heart?
There's a great anecdote about that where the chair of the Temporary Study Commission, Harold Hochschild, went down to see Rockefeller and said, you know, Governor, is there really a realistic chance that this is going to pass? And Rockefeller apparently said back to Harold Hochschild, Harold, I'm not an environmentalist. I'm a power broker. But if you can tell me that there's real statewide support for this, if you can demonstrate that to me, I'll pass it for you. And so Hochschild did that, and Rockefeller passed it for him.
And Hochschild was the chair of the Temporary Study Commission.
Yes.
Was the commission put together in a way by Nelson Rockefeller well, let me think of the best way to phrase this question. Was the study commission put together by Rockefeller for his brother Lawrence, who was still maybe smarting a little from his push a few years earlier to turn part of the Adirondack Park into a national park?
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to interview Lawrence Rockefeller. He was not able to grant an interview, so I never got the chance to ask him that directly. And Nelson, of course, died in 1979. But several of the people who were close to the process said that, yes, essentially, Nelson Rockefeller appointed this study commission under pressure from several groups, but notably under pressure from Lawrence, who was his best friend, as well as his younger brother. And Lawrence, of course, was passionate about creating parks. So Lawrence wanted the Adirondacks to be a national park and had proposed that in 1967. And it was just, it was a non-starter. Everybody hated that idea. But not everybody, but a lot of people agreed with Lawrence at the same time that the Adirondacks were under threat and something needed to happen. So in order to ameliorate the environmental community and also please his younger brother, his best friend, Rockefeller appointed this commission. And the interesting thing about the commission that I discovered just from digging into the archival record was that there was sort of a private fight on the commission between the people who favored the idea of a national park style development for the Adirondacks and the people who were passionately devoted to the forever wild Adirondacks. And basically the forever wild people won.
Though supporting the national park would have probably supported allowing more motorized vehicles, allowing
Correct.
More tourists to come in and have access to the forest preserve and other wilderness areas.
Exactly. The forever wild clause in the Constitution, which bars the cutting of a single tree on state-owned land in the Adirondacks without a statewide referendum, that would have gone away had the core of the Adirondacks been transferred to the National Park Service. And then the National Park Service would have developed the high peaks and the central lakes of the Adirondacks and so forth, national park style, which meant parking areas, snack bars, beaches, and giving the maximum number of people access to the resource, which was really not the Forever Wild Clause's idea.
And which was something the Rockefellers had done elsewhere. Acadia National Park in Maine.
Jackson Hole National Park, Redwoods National Park, Virgin Islands National Park. I mean, the Rockefellers were probably the most important private donors to the national park system and had an instrumental role in the creation of at least a half a dozen parks. And from Lawrence's point of view, the Adirondacks were a real prize because not only were they national park quality, they were also within a day's drive of 1/6 of the U.S. population.
Did that put him at odds with other members of the Temporary Study Commission?
Oh, very much so. In fact, one of the things that Peter Payne told me when I interviewed him was that Lawrence was a family friend of the Paynes. He was a classmate of Peter Payne Sr. And Lawrence came up to the Payne farm to do some grouse hunting and visit once when this Adirondack National Park idea was basically being battered about. And Lawrence was kind of baffled by it. Why doesn't the environmental community support this idea? And Peter, who was 31 years old at the time, but was then as now perfectly willing to state his opinion to anybody who asked, said, well, Lawrence, it's because the Forever Wild Clause is beloved to people in New York State. They don't want it to change, and in fact, we think it's better than the National Park Service.
And it wouldn't change under the Temporary Study Commission. That would stay intact.
The recommendations that the Temporary Study Commission produced at the beginning of 1971 basically were to strengthen the protections of the Forever Wild Clause on the state land by creating a system of wilderness areas. And in fact, the wilderness protections in the Adirondacks are stronger than they are under federal rules because of the Forever Wild Clause. But the real thing that the Temporary Study Commission did that was truly revolutionary was they recommended the establishment of a state agency which would control the development of 3.5 million acres of private land.
Zoning. They would zone all of that land, taking that control away from 100+ towns and villages that normally would decide things like zoning and
Yes, zoning is ordinarily a town and village level responsibility. And there's a tradition in New York, a constitutionally protected principle called home rule, which is that certain functions, zoning being one of them, are usually the provenance of town and village governments. The Adirondack Park Agency was really a wild idea for several reasons, but one of them was that the state came in and said, no, unfortunately, to the 101 towns and villages of the Adirondacks, you can't handle the challenges that this park is facing. So the state is going to install standards, and we hope that you will live up to them someday, but these are the new standards. And the local people, of course, didn't like that one bit.
They revolted.
They did.
Government leaders thought it was overreach on the part of the state. Did they, as a result, were they reluctant to go along with it, or were they staunch in their opposition?
That's an interesting thing, too. A lot of the people I interviewed who were local officials at the time, and a lot of the people on the APA side, in the years after the APA was instituted, said that the meetings between the APA and local officials, the private meetings, were often a lot more cordial and cooperative than the public meetings. And the local officials would frequently be appreciative or supportive or at least understanding of what the APA was trying to do when they were in their private office with the doors closed. But then they would go to a public meeting that night and just rip the APA up and down. And the reason was that it was the people inside the Adirondack Park were so insulted by the idea of the APA that really you couldn't get reelected if you publicly supported it inside the Blue Line.
And was that the same for assembly members and senators, Ron Stafford, Glenn Harris, other people who at the time were the representatives up here? Did they have to ride a fine line, or were they, for the most part, against this idea?
It varied. I think it varied a great deal. I think that Glenn Harris and Andy Ryan in the Assembly, who were the two main assemblyman for the park and the two leaders of the opposition to the APA, I think that both of them truly believed that the Adirondack Park Agency was a bad idea and that it should be abolished. Ron Stafford is a very, very interesting case. Unfortunately, I never got to talk to Ron directly. He was too ill by the time I got started. But several of Ron's aides and people who worked with Ron closely over the decades said that Ron essentially stood aside when he was in Albany and didn't actively oppose the agency, although Ron, like every other elected official in the North Country, made fiery speeches opposing the park agency when he was in front of crowds.
Were some steps taken, though, to help try to win his favor? For example, were the boundaries of the park extended to further cover up into the northeastern corner and to protect Valcour Island from a marina development project that was proposed there?
Yeah, there's a great anecdote about that. Ron Stafford, as many of the viewers know his story, Ron Stafford was an orphan. And he was, his earliest memories were of an orphanage. Peter Payne and Dick Lawrence and Harold Hochschild arranged for a private dinner with Ron Stafford at Dick Lawrence's house in Elizabethtown. And Stafford at that time was in his early 30s. These two older men and his colleague, his peer, Peter Payne, were all sitting around being really nice to him. And, Dick Lawrence was old enough to be Ron's father. Harold Hochschild was probably old enough to be his grandfather. And they really, they sweet-talked him to expand the boundaries of the park. And, these were men that Ron would have loved to have been around. So he readily said yes to all their demands. And after that, I found a letter in the archives where Hochschild was writing back to Lawrence. And he said that it was a good thing that Dick Lawrence didn't spike the iced tea, because if he had, we probably would have annexed Quebec as well.
And there was also a connection between Ron Stafford and Harold Jerry. Harold's father was at the law firm where Ron Stafford ended up.
Harold Jerry was Ron Stafford's best man when Ron Stafford married I think in the 1990s. They were friends from childhood, really, and Harold was kind of a surrogate older brother to Ron. So Ron used to go to Harold's camp at Dug Mountain outside of Speculator and spend the weekend. And he and Jerry were on opposite sides politically, but they were really close friends.
If there was so much opposition to this, how in the world did it pass?
It really threaded the needle. It very easily might not have passed, but there were several things that happened where the timing was just perfect. The original law in 1971 was introduced in April, which was also Earth Day. And I don't know if you recall, there was a very famous commercial called The Crying Indian.
Sure.
A PSA where, the Indian with a tear running down his. That came out about 2 weeks before the bill was released. And people absolutely went nuts. This passion for protecting the environment was at a fever pitch. Then 2 years later, when the private land plan was released, Rockefeller, the APA said, look, this is just a ridiculous amount of work. We're never going to get to it all. Can't we have another year to do this so that people can really digest the plan and we can do it right? And Rockefeller said, no, you've got to turn it in for a 1973 legislative session or we're not going to consider it. So he insisted that the bill be considered in 1973 for a couple of reasons. One was that it was not a statewide election year, so that it wouldn't become a statewide political issue. But the other was that I think Rockefeller might already have had his eye on the door. He announced to his staff that he was resigning as governor to run for president for the fourth time, 3 months after he signed the private land plan into law. So he basically abandoned the Adirondack Park Agency as soon as he created it.
Was he looking for something big and bold, though, that he could point to say?
Absolutely.
here's what I did.
Yeah, Rockefeller's brand was to be the smartest governor in the United States. And the most well-connected governor. He knew all the best people. Rockefeller was the leader of what used to be called the establishment. And he was constantly demonstrating or seeking to demonstrate that he was out in front. And with the Adirondack Park Agency, that was part of essentially building his brand.
So in May of 1971, the Adirondack Park Agency Act passed, which created the APA. And then the APA had to go about coming up with the two documents, the master plan for the state land and then the land use document for all the private land. And that took 2 years, and that's what was voted on in 1973.
Correct.
And leading up to that, in late 1972 and early 1973, were these very contentious hearings that were held around the Adirondack Park and beyond. And again, they heard so much opposition from people at these hearings. Was there surprise on the part of the commission members and others that it continued on and that the plans were approved?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that the Adirondack Park Agency Board was at all surprised that people in the park were angry. In the minutes, it's pretty clear that they knew they were going to get put through the ringer no matter what they proposed. I think there was a great deal of concern on the board's part that the process was moving so quickly and that a lot of questions hadn't been answered by the time they had to release the document to the public. But no, they weren't particularly surprised. They knew that a storm was coming. But also, I think there's also a lot of evidence that the chair, Richard Lawrence in particular, he really wasn't all that concerned about reaction inside the Blue Line. Most of the people, all of the people he needed to impress and convince were either in Albany or New York City.
And he felt confident that it would be passed, and it did end up passing.
Well, he knew, I think Lawrence knew, that if he could get the governor's support, he needed a 7-2 favorable vote to get the governor's support, and he got that. And if he could get the environmental movement's support, and with the support of Harold Hochschild and other environmental leaders, he got the environmental movement behind it. If he had those two things, it would pass, and he did get those two things.
That was an era when the media consisted mostly of newspapers, and Richard Lawrence said in your book, he was quoted by someone you interviewed in the book, that if it had been a different era, he's not sure it would have passed. It was an era when the newspapers would cover the hearings in their towns, but there wasn't wide coverage across the entire Adirondack Park. And that if that had been the case, if the television stations and all the newspapers had reported on every single hearing and the opposition that they heard at those hearings, that it may have been a different story.
I think so. I think one of the reasons why the legislature was able to pass the private land plan without a lot of controversy was that the word never reached them effectively of the extent of the dismay and anger that was present inside the Blue Line. Individual newspapers and individual reporters covered the hearings, but strangely, they never coordinated. And the people in Star Lake, for example, really weren't aware that the people in Elizabethtown were just as mad as they were. And so they never got together. On the other hand, the environmental community was exquisitely well organized. They were truly an army. And the information manager for that was Bob Cafin, who's still a lawyer down in Glens Falls. He was hired by the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. He and his partner, Ed Needleman, were hired to keep tabs on what was going on. And they used public sources, but also private back channel sources to produce these newsletters about what was going on in the Adirondacks and in the APA, so that everyone in the environmental community knew exactly when they needed to speak and what they needed to say. They spoke with one voice.
And they had kind of a new strategy on how to go about all of this.
Oh yeah, yeah. The environmental movement certainly did. This was really one of its first big victories using this strategy. But also the planners who were making the Adirondack Park Agency plan were trying something new as well.
Saranac Lake seemed to be ground zero for a lot of the opposition. You interviewed one of the developers from Saranac Lake, Frank Cashier, and there were also the newspaper in town. The owner of the newspaper, Will Doolittle, at the time was opposed.
I interviewed him too.
You did. His thought was this was just an overreach on the part of the state, or the rich trying to control the poor, or?
Bill Doolittle was really an interesting interview because that really was his orientation. He was a reporter who got the chance to own a newspaper, so that he bought the Adirondack Daily Enterprise because it was his chance to own a newspaper. But as a reporter, he said his favorite things to cover were strikes and civil rights demonstrations. And he came from a wealthy background, but he was very much on the side of the workers and the dispossessed and the poor and the marginalized. And he felt that the APA was rich people pushing poor people around. So he was not a developer who was angry because he was going to lose money. Frank Cashier was a developer who was angry because he was going to lose money. But when I talked to Frank, I think the money really wasn't what was causing Frank's anger. Frank made lots and lots of money developing real estate in Florida. He didn't take such a big hit when the APA went into effect. He just felt that it was wrong. He felt that private property should be private, and that if there are going to be controls on the use of that private property, they should be decided on by local people, which I think is a legitimate point.
And when you interviewed him back in the early 2000s, he still spitting mad about this, angry to this day, or to his final days?
He was resigned. It was a long time in the past, but as we talked about it, he became more and more animated and more angry. Frank was a great source because he saved all of his paper, and so really there was very little documentation of the anti-APA movement. But Frank's 16 banker boxes of material that he collected over the years did end up in the archives of SUNY Albany, which I was very proud of.
And there are some pictures. Wasn't it Frank who had the van that was painted up, abolished the APA?
The War Wagon, yes. Some of your viewers will remember the War Wagon, which was a bread truck, a delivery truck, that Frank painted blue with "Abolish the APA" on a big sign on the side of it. And he would basically load up a bunch of people from Saranac Lake and drive the War Wagon to wherever the APA was holding a hearing. So the same protesters would show up every time. And some of them were truly incensed by the Adirondack Park Agency, but some of them I think were just out to have a good time. Some of them were sober and some of them were not so sober. But Frank made sure that wherever the APA was, they knew that they weren't welcome.
It wasn't really the Frank Cashiers, though, of the world that the APA was designed, created to keep an eye on.
No.
Even as all of this was happening, there were some major developments on the drawing board.
Yes.
Throughout the Adirondacks, thousands of proposed second homes at that time.
Yeah, and it was really the specter of these enormous second home, vacation home developments that more than anything else pushed the APA into law. There were two that were sort of the poster children in terms of being a threat. One was the Horizon Corporation, which had made a lot of money carving up rural land in Arizona, the west coast of Florida, North Carolina, places like that. They would buy enormous tracts of land, carve it up into 10,000 or so home sites, and sell each one individually in areas that had no zoning. So there was no restriction on selling the land, nothing had to be met. And that would leave the township with an enormous headache once the land had all been broken up. So the Horizon Corporation bought 24,000 acres south of Canton and announced its proposal to do this in the Adirondacks. And that got the environmental community really excited. There was also a guy named Louis Paparazzo who bought who bought land north of Tupper Lake and had a different vision. He was going to make an environmentally responsible second home community, which he called Tondele, which a name that he made up. And he put a lot more thought and a lot more planning into it, but it was still the same beast. It was 4,000 homes in a rural area, and the environmental community said no.
And did the creation of the APA and its land use plan essentially kill all of those developments?
Those two big ones, yes. In fact, there's a great story about that that George Davis told me. George Davis was basically the leader of the private land plan creation for the APA. But before he was hired by the APA, George Davis was a graduate student at Cornell with 3 kids to feed and and a wife who was taking care of the kids. He really needed money. He was a starving graduate student. He had worked for the Temporary Study Commission. Louis Paparazzo called him up and said, look, I'm putting together this development, Tondele. I'd like an environmental impact statement. I don't really know what that is, but I think it'd be a good thing for a guy like me to do because I'm environmentally responsible. Will you write me an environmental impact statement? And George Davis said, I don't know, because he really didn't want the development, but he really needed the money. So George said yes, and he went and he walked all over Louis Paparazzo's land, and he made an assessment of it, and he used that exercise and that contract as a sort of a field test of the methods that he later used to write the private land plan. And he turned it into Paparazzo. Paparazzo ignored what George Davis did, but he paid him. And then George was hired by the APA, and he basically did that on a much larger scale, and what he produced there put the kibosh on Paparazzo's plans. Sort of a great story.
And did he set the standard? After that, was a lot more attention paid to wetlands and wildlife habitat and these development proposals? Did they look beyond the sheer number of homes? Did they look at a lot of other factors?
Yeah, absolutely. The principle behind the private land plan is called carrying capacity. And the idea is to use data on soil, wildlife, slopes, other things, to rate the ability of a given acre to handle development without damaging the integrity of the surrounding areas. So a wetland, for example, is not a place where you want to do building because it's going to spoil the water supply downstream. And these were not exactly new ideas in 1971 when the APA was working with them, but they had never been done on such a vast scale before. And the APA really had to do a lot of innovation and a lot of legwork to check out the characteristics of this massive, an area the size of the state of Vermont.
Were the targets of the APA these giant developments? And did it really not have much of an impact on the average homeowner, the average landowner in the Adirondacks?
Well, I think the answer is yes and no. It's not a clear answer. The main reason the law was passed was to control these giant developments, and it was more or less a complete success at that. The backcountry of the Adirondacks today is still large, unbroken, privately owned forests. But the way the law was passed, it was very complex. It didn't only regulate density of the backcountry. There was also a lot of regulation of lakefront development. As we said previously, there was a lot of regulation of wetlands. And so it really got down, into the weeds, no pun intended. And in that way, if you owned 20, 25 acres in Minerva, and you had always thought that maybe you would subdivide it and sell a lot to finance your kids' college education or your own retirement or something, in many cases the APA rules made that impossible. So ordinary people were hurt by the APA to a certain extent. But at the same time, the environmentalists argued, and I think there's a lot of evidence for this, that the wide open character of the park was what tourists pay money to see. And tourism was really the only industry in the Adirondacks that had much of a future in the 1970s. So while a few homeowners were hurt by the APA regulations, the protections it put in place really made the modern park possible.
And speaking of the modern park, with that much open space now, in this era, 50 years later, with climate change such a huge issue, a lot of people look at the Adirondack Park and they say, wow, there's a place where they're doing a great job. Such open space, such forest, reducing the amount of carbon from the atmosphere.
Yeah, I think so. The term is carbon sink, and the idea that a large unbroken forest is an important way of mitigating the effects of climate change is something that I think is re-energizing the conservation movement. And the term of art in the business is landscape level conservation. Protections on the scale of the Adirondacks, not always on the scale of the Adirondacks, but protecting an entire bioregion, which has important benefits not only for climate change, it also has important benefits for biodiversity, which is a quieter issue, but which is also, I would say, just as serious an environmental crisis as climate change. So yeah, I think the Adirondacks is now getting the Adirondack Park Agency and the protection of the Adirondacks is now getting a lot more attention and a lot more respect, because the globe now needs to do what New York State did 50 years ago.
Revolutionary at the time. Is it still held up today as a model?
Not so much, no. I think the way the Adirondack Park Agency was put in place was very much a function of its time. I don't think it could happen again in the same way. And one of the interesting things now is that environmentalists are actually angrier at the Adirondack Park Agency today than developers are. Developers, I think, by and large have learned to live with it. And some of the developers I spoke with also said, I agree, it did protect property values in the park by protecting the wide open character. So, there's still a lot of grumbling and grousing about all of the red tape, but really the people who are hardest on the APA now are the hardcore environmentalists.
So unlikely it could pass today.
I don't think so, not in the way that it's structured. But at the same time, we desperately need to find ways to protect large, unbroken natural areas, in order to mitigate climate change.
Is part of it that back then, in the early 70s, people would put their trust in the government? They would say, well, the state says we need this. We need the state agency to oversee zoning. It's in our best interest to preserve the wilds of the Adirondacks. Is that something that just wouldn't happen today? Would people not put their trust in the government like they did in the early 70s?
Yes, I think that's a factor. And also, in this particular case, there were 19 million people in New York in 1970, and only 100,000 of them lived inside the blue line. So really, it was easy for a legislator or a person living in the suburbs of Rochester, as Liz Thorndike was at the time, to say, yes, we should do this. It's a good idea. We need to protect this natural resource, because it was almost an abstraction. And so really one of the interesting things about this project is it's a story about the rights of minority groups, even though in this case the minority group was, white rural landowners.
And while it's celebrated on one hand, on the other, did the APA early on make mistakes? Were they tone deaf to a number of things that made it more difficult?
Oh yes, I think the APA really was an amazing accomplishment in many ways, but it had a major flaw, which was not entirely its own fault, in that it didn't really listen to local people before it put the laws into effect. So that the laws, when they were presented to people inside the blue line, they just felt like an insult. They felt insulted that they hadn't been talked to, they hadn't been listened to, and that the new order had come from Albany, and it felt like an invasion. So the opposition to the APA was really came from a place of insult, not necessarily economic loss.
And you wanted to make sure that you talked to a lot of those opponents, right? You really wanted to balance this story to have both sides. Being a longtime journalist, you wanted to hear from a lot of those opponents about what motivated them.
Yes, I wanted to talk to the opposition and save what I could of their movement, because the environmental movement's records were exquisitely well preserved. And I didn't have any trouble finding environmentalists who were willing to talk at length about this major accomplishment that they were very proud of. But the opposition was almost entirely undocumented. And as I got further into the story, I realized that that was a very interesting aspect of this, and that the people on the other side really had some good points. So as I worked further into the oral history project, I tried harder and harder to find people who had fought the APA, and I'm very glad I did.
You ended up interviewing 50, 60 people altogether?
It's about 60
60
now,
people,
yeah.
all key insiders, pioneers, many of them, and great stories about the environmentalists, George Davis, Clarence Petty, who was certainly well known by many people, a state forest ranger, and so you really brought to light many of the people behind the scenes who were so passionate about making this happen, making it a reality, and on the flip side, people who were so dead set against it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found that really kept me engaged for all the time it took me to do this is that people in the North Country tend to be excellent storytellers. I think it's the long, dark winters. People really know how to spin yarns up here. And so, you know, I would just show up at somebody's house and turn on my tape recorder, and all of this great stuff would be coming out of the subject. And so it was a joy to really collect that material.
And you know, I've got to ask you, already talked about some of the stories with George Davis being hired by the developer, but anything come to mind as far as just some really great stories from some of these characters?
Oh, there are so many of them. One of my favorites is, again, from George Davis. He was the first employee of the Adirondack Park Agency. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, Nelson Rockefeller basically didn't fund the agency very well, didn't support it in Albany.
The state was going through a budget crisis at the time.
Correct. There was no money. So he was alone for a long time. George said that he got the key to the abandoned building in Raybrook that the agency had been allowed to use, the log cabin there. Got the key from the DEC guy next door, and he went in on his first day, and there was absolutely nothing inside, and nobody inside, nothing. It was an empty building. He was the Adirondack Park Agency. So what he decided to do was he got a purchase order, which he had learned from the DEC guy that you could take into town and use to get stuff. And he bought 2 cartons of toilet paper, 2 big cartons of toilet paper. And he brought them back, and he used one of them for his desk and one of them for his chair. And when the phone got hooked up, he put the phone on top of one of the cartons of toilet paper. He said it was like that for several weeks. He eventually got furniture by begging for it, because there was no money to buy furniture. But he found that the prison in Raybrook was getting rid of some desks. The prison in Raybrook was getting rid of some desks, and some great camps were breaking up. And so he furnished the Adirondack Park Agency offices, basically on the 1971 version of Craigslist.
Humble beginnings. You talked about, at the end of the book, how you had a lot of research, a wealth of research, and so you still have more. You're sitting down with many of these people, talking for hours on end, which the audio recordings, the videotape are certainly priceless, but you have a wealth of research that you still haven't necessarily gotten to. So is there another book coming out of this potentially?
Yes, I am actively working on a second volume right now that will talk about the 1970s and beyond. When the pandemic closed everything down, I had done all of the research and interviewing that I needed to do to get the reader to the point where the law was signed. So that's where this current book ends, is with the formation of the opposition and the signing of the law. But I have all of this other stuff that's still on the table. So now I'm going around interviewing, doing additional interviews, additional research, and I hope to produce a second volume in a couple of years.
And you'll look at some of the big land sales that happened in the 80s, 90s, and Finch Prine in 2007.
Yes, I was very fortunate to be able to interview George Pataki. Pataki, not surprisingly, was very eager to talk about the 1 million acres of forest preserve that he protected under his administration.
Mm-hmm.
And so those big land deals, really starting with Bay Pond in the late 1970s and ending with the massive Finch Prine deal in 2007, will be part of this next volume. Big land deals always have interesting stories attached to them when you dig into it.
And obviously a lot of controversy over the years with the APA.
Nothing like the APA to stir up a fight, yes.
Well, we'll look forward to the book, and who knows, perhaps another documentary out of that, but we will look forward to the documentary on this. This will be coming out this fall here on Mountain Lake PBS.
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy it.
We will enjoy sharing that with everyone. Brad Edmonson, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate the time.
Great. Will will come out now and get a couple of wide shots, and I'll ask you if there's anything we didn't touch on that you'd like to.
No, you were, that was exhaustive.
Sorry.
It was great. Actually, those are good questions.
Well, and I like conversations where I'm still on page 1. I never got to.
I do that too. I do a ton of research, and then if the interview's going well, I just throw it away.
Yeah. Well,
it helps to do the research, but yeah, you'd obviously done your work. I can't think. There's a lot we didn't get to, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think okay. Then we'll get a couple of shots here, and we'll think about it before we get you on mic. If you're like, oh, wait a minute.
Is this B-roll?
Yeah. Well, a wider shot setup.
Yeah, one of the things about working with Paul Frederick is he's got 30 years of B-roll.
Yes, he does. And he was here for, 20 years. Did he tell you the story about getting arrested?
Oh, yeah, he showed me the footage.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Yes. We found the raw footage.
Oh, did you?
We did. We found the field tape and gave it to him.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, he was quite
He's
happy
very
to
proud
get that.
of that. Yes. But who was the cameraman who got Maynard Parker?
Jack LeDuc, who now works for us. Jack is 86 and still goes out and turns stories with his golden retriever. He
shot that.
He did, from Channel 3 News, and so he still talks about that to this day.
Yeah, I'll have to talk to him.
Although when Jack tells you the story, he makes it sound like it was about 2 years ago that he went down and got Maynard punching the, was it Earth First guy?
Yeah.
I can't remember, the guy, Paradox Lake, right, I think?
Crane Pond Road.
Is that down that way?
Yeah, that's around there.
Okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Maynard just died just a couple of months ago.
Oh, actually, that's right, Jack mentioned that.
And
That's
I never spoke to him, but I really would like to track down the Earth First guy.